Last time, I created the character, the blocks that they'll be digging, and how the game controls. Then I asked you folks what you thought about reward ads versus microtransactions. And there were a lot of different opinions, but overall it came down to both of them are okay for different reasons, with reward ads coming out on top. So when I get to the point of the game where I add that stuff in, I'm gonna try to keep that in mind. But for this video, I had the goal of finishing the gameplay loop. Getting the core part of the game finished, which included stamina for the character, fuel that you can run out of, consumable objects that you can use, and then when you run out of those resources, you're sent back to the base, where you'll eventually be able to spend your money on upgrades and things like that. But before I got a chance to get started, my favorite pixel artist, Artman Oil, dropped in and told me that my character looked not good.
Ugh, it's hideous!
Oh, that's not very nice.
It was hard to make out where different parts of the character were, notably the arms and legs and all that, and the background didn't give you enough contrast with the character, so it all sort of blended together. So they suggested that I redo the character a bit and give the different parts of the character outlines. So I got to work, quickly realizing that I don't like drawing arms and just hacked those off. So now the character is going to be like Rayman or my character from my last game, with just floating hands. And while I was redoing the character, I realized that the background was still not going to offer enough contrast against the character. Even with the outlines, they would kind of blend in. So I changed it to a pure black background and got to work on putting something there. At first I started with stars to see how that would look, because they are technically in space. It's supposed to be a game where you're digging into an asteroid, so using stars as the background made sense, but it didn't look that great. So I tossed that out and decided to go for asteroid-like debris, as if you were in an asteroid field. So I grabbed the rock particles that I used earlier and put those into the background, and then took the gold crystals and put them back there too, thinking that that would add a little bit of color and make it look nice. It didn't. So I changed the gold crystals into another kind of asteroid debris piece of the same color, made them transparent, and then made them scroll with the screen. But then I wanted to get to the consumables, which are going to be a big part of the strategy of the game, because in the old game, you would buy a certain number of consumables and then use them in the next round to try to get more points than you would if you were just digging yourself, or to get to spots that you can't reach anymore. So the first consumable was a drop drill, and I just set that up so that when you put it into the game, you get a little grid overlay, and then as long as it's not in a spot with a block, it will drop the drill, but I ended up putting a limit on the number of blocks it'll dig, because in this version of the game, you can go down really quickly, and the camera follows you. So without that, you could just place a single drill and then follow it all the way down and get infinite points. So now it digs out 6 blocks, which means in-game, if I make it worth 100 points, then you can use that to dig out a series of gold blocks without using up your stamina and getting more back than you spent on the drill, which is where the bit of strategy comes in. But next I needed to work on the stamina, because that was the resource that when it runs out, the round's over. When your character is too tired to continue working, you've got to stop. And this was just a matter of making a stamina variable, and then changing the width of the stamina bar based on how much you've used up, compared to how much you had. And then I tried to make a strawberry icon to show you that that was their stamina bar based on how hungry they were. I did end up having to change the scale of those things, which now means the stamina bar and fuel bar are taking up even more of the UI, which I know is a problem because looking at how I have it set up, the controls and UI are taking up the vast majority of the screen. So I will probably need to change that later at some point. Then I set up the fuel bar in the same way, and the fuel is going to be used up whenever you go upwards. And I did this for 2 reasons. 1, to remind the player that they're supposed to be going down, and limit the amount of times they can go up. And second is to have another thing that they can spend money on to upgrade. And with that in place, I went back to the consumables. The next one being a bomb. This one was going to have a different UI layout. This one was going to have a different UI layout thing.
That'll do, donkey. That'll do.
To show how big the explosion was going to be. So I drew that, and then I got to work on the bomb, which is just a circle with some shading and a rope on top. I did animate the rope though, and I think that looks good. Then it was just a matter of putting the bomb into the game, putting it into the same group as the drill, so the game treats it the same way, meaning I can drag it into the scene, and when I let go, it'll pop back down to the UI spot it was in. And then I put 4 points around the bomb to use to check for blocks, and then when the bomb's animation finishes, it sets the health of all of those blocks to 0, which destroys them. Then I created some particle effects to go with it, sticking with the square blocky look for particles. And of course I added some screen shake and a sound effect. And in the original game, there was a consumable object called Gold Rush that you could buy in the early game, and when you used it, it changed all of the blocks on the scene to gold, which was really good early game, but kind of useless later as there were other resources that you didn't want to overwrite. So I wanted to make something that was going to be useful during the early game and late game. So I decided to make an object that would change the area around where it was placed. So I drew this metal capsule with a blue fluid in it, and little black flecky bits that would be some kind of MacGuffin that would change the ore. And then I did the same thing as the bomb. I put it into the scene and added it to the consumable group. And then when you placed it into the scene, it would check for a range around it, and anything within that range has its animation go up by 3, which would put it into the next ore tier. So if the rock has 3 gold ore on it, it will change to the next one up, which in this case temporarily is jade. Then I created some blue magical particles and added a sound effect. And then this consumable was done. Really quickly, I need to ask you a favor. Could you comment down below and tell me which game you've played with the best shop menus? I know that sounds silly, but every game has one, and some games do them better than others. So let me know, because when I'm done with the consumables and the gameplay loop, that's the next thing I need to tackle. And then the last consumable was actually just going to be an easy one for fuel. So you'll be able to spend points on getting more of these fuel canisters to use in game. And for that I just copied over the buffing fluid, changed the color to gold, and then when it's placed into the scene, gave it a little bob up and down. And right now it's kind of big, but it'll do.
That'll do.
And up to now they weren't actually consuming anything. There was just an infinite supply of these objects. So I created a text object and put it in scene to act as the number to represent how many you have left, and then I added some global variables to actually keep track of how many you have, starting off the game with 1 just for testing. And then I set it up so that if you had 0 of that consumable, it would just not be there anymore, which does 2 things. 1, looks much better, but 2, helps act as the early game tutorial, because the first time you play the game, if the only thing that's there is the joystick, then obviously you know you're supposed to use the joystick. It's going to reduce the number of options on screen, which is great because it's one less thing I need to teach in an in-game tutorial. And from there, the last thing I had to do was set it up so that when you ran out of stamina, you got sent back to base, or your ship, or something. I'm not sure yet. But for now, it sends you back to a blank void. A huge thank you to my patrons. Because of them, my coffee cup is full. And as always, the links to the places that I hang out are down below, and if you decide to click on one, then I'll see you there.